In this video, we're going to continue on our OSHA discussion by talking about confined spaces. Okay, this is part of environmental safety and health. OSHA requires all employees who enter into confined spaces to receive training on hazards, procedures, and equipment required in a confined space. Now, we have some definitions we have to talk about. An entrant is a person who enters the confined space. An attendant is the person who stays with the entrant outside the confined space and is responsible for assisting the entrant in exiting the confined space and calling for emergency assistance when required. The safety representative is the qualified person who evaluates the hazards, prescribes the required equipment and precautions, and issues the confined space entry permit. So we have to look here, and these are all examples of confined spaces and some of the signs you see outside the confined space. Okay, a permit and certain safety regulations must happen before you can enter a confined space. The reason for this whole presentation and all the regulations with this, at the end of this session, you'll recognize confined spaces and be familiar with the hazards and the requirements of safe confined space entry. So, what are the hazards? Both animal and plant life have to have oxygen to live. One of the primary hazards of entering a confined space is oxygen deficiencies. When oxygen is present in concentrations less than 19.5%, the atmosphere is said to be oxygen deficient. Oxygen can also be present in concentrations that are too high. Oxygen in concentrations greater than 23% is too oxygen rich and can cause combustible materials to ignite very quickly. Now, this is also important to remember outside of confined spaces, like when you're in a residence where someone is on oxygen. Oxygen deficiency can be caused by several processes. Consumption. You can be using too much oxygen by doing too much activity for the oxygen that's available and the fresh air that's available. Displacements could be denser materials push the oxygen out of the occupied space. For those of you who work with refrigerants, that's an example of what can happen. Nitrogen can do that as well. Reaction. Oxygen is made up with other materials to make other components. So oxygen can react with something else, and it can make a component that you cannot breathe. After oxygen is delivered to the body organs, okay, it's used by the organ cells, and it reacts to the carbon monoxide, or it reacts with carbon to make carbon dioxide. Red blood cells carrying the carbon dioxide turn blue. Carbon dioxide is then carried back to the lungs by the red blood cells and is exhaled into the surrounding atmosphere. The human body requires oxygen to carry out the cellular metabolism. Oxygen is brought in through the lungs and transported to the cells of the body organs by red blood cells. When blood is rich in oxygen, it turns red. So, given a fixed amount of oxygen, as you would have in a confined space, respiration of the oxygen causes carbon dioxide to increase. When oxygen decreases to less than 19.5%, the oxygen is said to be oxygen deficient, putting the occupants of the confined space at risk of losing consciousness and death. Processes which operate by the principle of combustion use up oxygen much faster than human respiration. Products of combustion vary with the fuel that is present and the temperature of the combustion reaction. Welding, burning natural gas, propane, gasoline, and diesel engines are examples of combustion processes. Manholes often remain covered for long periods of time. Naturally occurring toxins such as hydrogen sulfide can accumulate inside the manholes. Manholes may also accumulate highly flammable gases such as methane and ethane. Unlike gas we receive at home, we cannot detect some of these gases with our sense of smell. Remember, the gases that we receive at home, natural gas and propane, have additives added. Confined space entries have the hazards of toxic and flammable materials, are sometimes illegally put into sanitary and storm sewers. Leaking tanks or spills may migrate underground, causing seepage into manholes. Materials can leach through soil many miles away. Some additional entry hazards is sudden releases of fluid solids, such as granulated sugar, salt, sand, and liquids. And dense gases can cause engulfment of the person inside underground tanks and pits. When torrential forces are suddenly released, people may be struck by moving objects or pushed helplessly downstream. When we're dealing with trenches, ravines, and other excavations, we may also consider them to be a confined space if there's a potential for accumulation of toxic gases, engulfment, or the depletion of oxygen. Many confined space entries involve a complex set of exposures to mechanical, electrical, pressure, and chemical hazards. Confined space entry begins with a confined space entry permit. The permit system requires that a qualified safety representative visit the work location and evaluate the conditions under which the entry will be made. A confined space entry permit includes the location and description of the confined space, the reason for entry, and who the permit is issued to, the name of company or the organization. Each process hazard to which the entrant may be exposed, adjacent operation or processes, and scheduled activity are reviewed. For each hazard identified, countermeasures are detailed on the confined entry permit. The confined entry space entry. The safety representative tests the space for hazardous concentrations of known harmful substances such as hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, and flammable liquids or gases. The concentration of oxygen is measured at the same time. Okay, and this picture actually shows us with the different tools that will be used. Okay, they'll use an oxygen gauge, they'll use space entry, other gauges to measure the chemicals and what they will be exposed to. If concentrations of materials are found to be at harmful levels, the confined space has to be ventilated to remove them before any entry. Sometimes if you're driving along and see the utility companies working on manholes and stuff like that, you'll see fresh air being blown in. So fresh air, outside air is blown into the space to dilute and remove contaminants and to supply oxygen. Should the concentration of contaminants remain at harmful levels, respirators may be required to assure a safe air supply. Okay, and again, some additional hazardous space areas. You'll see over on the right-hand picture, they're using a respirator and a full body suit. On the left-hand picture, someone is welding in a confined space, and there's oxygen being put into the confined space. Means of emergency rescue must be readily available to the confined space entry attendant and for emergency extraction of the entrance. So there has to be a readily available way to get the person in the confined space out. Okay, normally it could be that the person is attached to a winch and a pulley along with a tripod head assembly. Once the person is lowered into the hole, into the confined space, or into the trench, the person remains attached to the pulley system and the tripod. They do not disconnect themselves. This is the way to get someone who might go unconscious out. A means must be provided for both safe and normal entry or exit and emergency extraction. Tripods with hoist, lifeline, and a full body harness are often used for emergency extractions. Ladders may be used for ordinary entry and exit. So there has to be two ways to get you out. We use a ladder for normal, and we use a harness and a rope and a pulley for emergency. Barriers must be present to prevent passers-by and the other curious people from falling into the opening. Holes and openings must be closed or guarded when there's no attendant there. And by the way, the attendant, who is the safety person, cannot leave the space when somebody is in it. Okay, place a warning sign where pedestrians can see them, and the sign must state the hazard and the required action. Okay, it's a caution sign. There's an opening in the ground, and we're telling people to keep out. And here's some examples of confined space warnings and caution barriers. And again, down here in the manhole situation, you can see where the air is being blown in. Confined space entry requires countermeasures to include personal protective equipment for hazards. Eye and head injuries are always potential, so safety glasses and hard hats are always required to wear for entrance. Other conditions may require the use of respirators, safety shoes, protective gloves, and other personal protective equipment. Okay, so on the confined space entry permit, there's a list of requirements for PPE, that's personal protective equipment, and a checkbox, yes or no. Is this required or not? Okay, required countermeasures also include prevention of electrical shock hazards due to loss of earth ground for portable tools. GFCIs, that's ground fault circuit interrupters, are required for portable electric tooling. There might also be a need to lock out and tag equipment both in the confined space and on adjacent equipment and processes. So again, your confined space entry permit will stay if these are requirements. Entrants must constantly monitor the confined space for toxic gases, oxygen, and combustible gases. Entrants will be issued a personal monitor to wear for this purpose. Entrants must leave the confined space when the monitor alarm is activated. It is the attendant's responsibility to see that the entrant leaves the space during an alarm. Okay, should conditions develop which require extraction and the entrant cannot get out of the confined space on their own, the attendant must call for emergency assistance at once. So again, they have to be able to get them out. The attendant should attempt to remove the entrant from the confined space using tripod, hoists, and lifeline. Attendants are not to ever enter the confined space because then instead of one victim, you now have two. Lethal hazards may be present within the confined space. Only properly equipped emergency rescue personnel may enter a confined space to make rescues. Okay, so again, confined space entry hazards can include the presence of toxic substances, insufficient oxygen, engulfment, presence of combustible gases and liquids, process or equipment-related hazards, conditions changing from non-hazardous to hazardous. The confined space entry permit requires countermeasures to determine by a qualified safety professional. Okay, once the countermeasures are in place, a permit is issued by the safety representative and the confined space may be entered. Should an emergency arise during the entry, the attendant notifies the emergency response team and attempts to extricate this entrant. Confined spaces are required to be labeled. Sometimes the space may have been overlooked, so you should contact your safety representative when in doubt. It's up to you to obey the signs and follow permit procedures before entry. Where can you get help? The supervisor of a confined space entry should be contacted for any equipment necessary to complete the task at hand. The safety representatives are responsible for answering questions about this confined space entry permit, countermeasures, sampling method, and instrumentation. And again, this is a buddy system. Okay, you must keep a person at the opening at all times during the entry to the confined space. For more References for sources and more information: OSHA 29 CFR, that's Chapter 29, Code of Federal Regulations, 1910.146, includes the permit required for confined spaces.